welcome to this conversation circle entitled Local Climate Voices, the Missing Key to Climate Action and Climate Justice. I will be with you for the next hour. We have a tremendous team of panelists who will be sharing their ideas and their learnings with all of us. In essence, the purpose of this conversation circle is to exchange ideas, exchange hope, challenges in the work that we're all doing. In essence, what we're discussing today is this idea, or is rooted in the idea of climate justice. Of course, as we all know, climate change and the effects of climate change are becoming increasingly and painfully evident with more frequent natural disasters, floods, storms that could be linked to climate change. And as we all know, there's a strong element of injustice in this equation, because the majority of the emissions that are causing climate change actually come from countries in the global north, and I guess more recently in places like China. But the majority of the people who live in the global south have actually contributed very little to climate change. Yet they're going to be, or we are going to be, the most impacted by the effects of climate change, as is already happening in places like Central America, in places like Eastern Africa. So we're beginning to see these impacts. And what we're also seeing is that the communities that are most affected, most impacted by climate change, are also the ones that are unable to exercise their right to communication. So there's a direct. You could almost think about it as a parallel. You know, if you're a vulnerable person, it also means that you're going to be affected, or you're already being affected by climate change. But it also means that you have information poverty, communication poverty. So you may not have access to communication platforms. You may not have access to the internet. You might be an indigenous person or an indigenous community that is not covered in mainstream media. You may speak a minority language. Yeah, you might be in a remote area of the world that is disconnected from decision-making centers. So there's an element of communication and information poverty, or communication and information deficits, that don't allow people most affected by climate change to be seen and to be heard. And at the same time, as we all know, in the failure, the colossal failure of the international community and the private sector to deal with climate change, because we see every year COP after COP after COP, that no meaningful change happens, or very little meaningful change happens in the face of the vast challenge that we have in front of us, that it actually is local communities that are the ones that are responding, that are the ones that are leading climate justice efforts by saying, keep oil in the ground, by saying, let's protect forests, let's protect water resources, in particular indigenous people that exercise ancestral territorial rights, that are actually protecting the world. And at the same time, these are communities that, as I said earlier, don't have a public voice. Often, of course, always they have a voice in their community, but when it comes to shaping the public conversation, they often are not in a position to do that. So that is what we will be speaking about today. You know, what are local voices? How can local voices make a difference? What are some examples of local action that is beginning to have an impact? Could this be brought to a larger scale? Does a communication rights approach to this make sense? So this is what we'll be speaking about today. And I apologize, I should have introduced myself. My name is Lorenzo Vargas, Program Manager with WACC, and also doing a PhD in the space of climate justice and communication rights. So I'm quite sort of involved in the space, and I am happy to introduce today's panelists. So we have 3 people who are joining us from 3 different regions of the world. The first person being Lia Mai Torres from the Philippines. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Concerns in Manila. And Leah has more than a decade of experience working in the space of environmental rights, climate justice, and especially the protection of land defenders. Of course, that's another major issue around the world, the violence that land defenders are facing. Actually, WACC had the opportunity to partner with Leah's organization in 2021 to develop a curriculum on climate justice and community engagement. And Leah has a bachelor in community development and a master's in environmental and natural resource management from the University of the Philippines. So welcome, Leah. She's joining us from Manila, where it is late. It is almost 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. So it's quite late. Then we have our friend Dev Kumar from Nepal. And Dev is a program director with Cultural Survival, which is a US-based organization that works for the rights of indigenous people. And Dev is responsible for Cultural Survival's Asia program. He's based in Kathmandu. And on top of doing that, which as if that wasn't already enough, Dev is also involved in, well, two big things. One is in the space of the United Nations, very active at the UN level to bring indigenous voices to those spaces. That's, you know, things like the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Indigenous Media Caucus of the United Nations as well. So he's leading that, and he's co-founded a number of media initiatives in Nepal, most notably Indigenous Television, which is South Asia's first and largest indigenous language television station. And Dev, as I said, is joining us from Kathmandu. So welcome, Dev. And last but not least, of course, is our friend Victor Lopez, who's joining us. He's from Guatemala, but he's joining us from Mexico City. Victor works for the Ford Foundation from their Mexico and Central America offices, and is primarily involved in the space of climate and advocacy efforts. He has been quite involved in the work of the protection of forest and communal lands in Guatemala, but also across Central America, and was also part of the Mesoamerican Alliance of People and Forests, which I'm hoping to hear more about later on. And we're thrilled to be working with Victor because we're partnering with the Ford Foundation and a group called Sandia Digital in Mexico to provide training in strategic communication to land defenders. So this is the actually pretty impressive panel that we've managed to assemble for this event. What we will do over the next 45 minutes or so will be 30 minutes of a panel discussion where we'll be sort of just sharing ideas and conversation. And afterwards, we'll have an open discussion with the audience. That'll be about 10 minutes, maybe 15 if we are good with our time management. And then at the end, we'll ask our panelists to provide one recommendation that they would, you know, if they could, I don't know if they will be at the COP 20, which is it, 28 in Dubai in December.
En diciembre.
What would be one thing that they would bring to this?
¿Qué sería lo que ellos dirían? Así que una vez más, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Alors, merci encore de votre présence. Nous vous encourageons de...
At WACC Global. So we'll begin. The first question that I have is, if you could please, maybe I'll begin with Leah. If you could please tell us about the work that your organization is doing in the Philippines in the space of climate justice.
Thanks, Lorenzo. So again, I'm Leah. I'm from the Center for Environmental Concerns in the Philippines, or CEC. We are a nonprofit organization working on environmental research, education, policy advocacy, and campaigns. So since we are based in the Philippines, just to give a short background of the situation, the Philippines is a small archipelago in Southeast Asia. We are comprised of about 100 million already. Our population has grown that big, and majority of that is still working on agriculture. So these are the fisher folk, farmers, and indigenous people. They also have the highest poverty rates, and they are also the most vulnerable to climate change. Unfortunately, they're also the sectors that do not have very good climate change education, mainly because climate change education is not well integrated into formal education or in the curriculum. So they are most of the time having difficulties in articulating what they're experiencing in a way that the government wants to hear about it in the quote-unquote scientific way of explaining their situation in terms of climate change. And that's where climate change education has been increasingly becoming important in the previous years. So that's why CEC has been working on climate education, focusing on these sectors. And it has been a privilege for us to partner with WACC on climate education in the previous years. So aside from climate education, we're also working with local communities affected by the different types of attacks, especially for environmental defenders who are very vocal about issues that are happening in their community. So in the recent Global Witness report, it was announced that the Philippines is still the deadliest place for environmental defenders in Asia. So we have been holding that spot for the past decade. And I think environmental defenders are being silenced basically because the government and corporations want to push through with big projects that they call that are for development. But we know that this is mainly for the profit of these few elites in the country. So we are also working on addressing this issue so that the environmental defenders won't be silenced and can continue to communicate their issues, especially in relation to climate change. So these are the two main advocacies that we are working on at the moment.
Thank you, Leah. And yeah, I did see that a couple of days ago there was a report, the sad yearly report that shows the countries with the most number of land defenders who were killed. And I did see that the Philippines indeed was top in Asia, though most of them actually in Latin America. Colombia, my country, where I am at the moment, is actually the top country. And then I think it's followed by, I think Mexico. Is it Mexico or Brazil? But it really is a tough spot that we're in with this situation. But perhaps this is a chance to hear a little bit from Victor, since he is in that region, to hear about what his organization is doing in this space.
Thanks, Lorenzo. The Ford Foundation international programs, and particularly the Natural Resources and Climate Change Program, start by recognizing that inequality in access, control, and benefit from the natural resources is intrinsically related to the abuses, the degradation, and the climate change. So we, first of all, try to support efforts from individuals, institutions, civil society organizations, and grassroots to challenge and to tackle those inequalities in several fronts. We in Latin America have supported for more than 2 decades relevant forest conservation, land collective rights endeavors, particularly in support of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, and other rural and local communities that whose work is crucial to protect not only biodiversity, but also to mitigate climate change, keeping those carbon reservoirs on on the ground, and also combining their work with inclusive alternative rural development initiatives. So our support is mostly in the region around that. And as you said, after the challenges that reality poses, for example, we support much more of the protection of land and environmental defenders, particularly indigenous organizations that, as you mentioned, in Mexico and Central America, we have 4 of the top 10 countries regarding killings and attacks to land and environmental defenders. So I will stop here, but that is a summary of our work.
Thanks, Victor. And of course, as you said, collective rights are absolutely essential in the protection of nature, of Mother Nature. And that's actually connected a little bit to the work that Dev and his organization has been doing in Nepal. Because I understand that, using media, you have been working to advance indigenous people's rights, and that has actually played a role in their struggles and their activism around climate in Nepal. So perhaps Dev, you can tell us a bit more.
Thank you, Lorenzo. First of all, I would like to start extending my gratitudes for WACC and all the team for providing this opportunity. Though I wear different hats as Lorenzo, as you introduced myself. About me, I work with the cultural survival, but mostly covering the Asia. And I am as the Asia program coordinator for cultural survival. So actually I will bring some lessons from the Asia as well, that how cultural survival is working with. And as maybe many of you have heard about the cultural survival or not, but the cultural survival is one of the pioneer indigenous-led organizations and one of the partner organization of the WACC itself. And it has an experience of over 50 years of long experiences to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and supporting indigenous people's right to self-determinations. And that is how we actually work in the ground. And the cultural survival has the programs that supports the indigenous community through advocacy, grant making, capacity building, and communication as well. And the theme actually is also focused on right-based approaches. That is having a link with the climate change, and also land and livelihoods. And also a community media is one of the component that we have been partnering with WACC and reaching out. And besides,
et comme tu le disais, Lorenzo, juste avant, j'ai également donc cofondé une station de télévision communautaire autochtone au Népal. Nous avons plusieurs programmes télévisés, mais aussi programmes radio pour diffuser les connaissances autochtones, principalement pour contrer les effets du changement climatique. Très souvent, les peuples autochtones sont vus comme les victimes, mais il faut se rappeler que très souvent, ce sont eux qui ont les connaissances de la terre, les connaissances des forêts et des ressources naturelles. Ils ont accumulé des siècles de connaissances pour s'adapter aux impacts et aux changements dans le climat. Donc, au Népal et dans toute l'Asie, au travers de ces différents programmes, nous avons pu diffuser ce savoir au travers de différents articles, des programmes radio. Et notre plaidoyer est aussi de faire entendre les voix autochtones dans les forums internationaux, comme par exemple les différentes COP. Nous avons travaillé pour faire entendre ces voix au travers de différentes plateformes, grâce à nos outils médiatiques.
What we do is, doing all this, we have been contributing to the communities.
Et donc, tout ce travail nous a vraiment permis d'aider les communautés, de faire entendre leur voix au niveau international. Et cela a sans doute aidé à apporter des solutions.
And that is all we do is based on their needs and based on their experiences. So this is basically a synopsis that I have been doing through a cultural survival and through my own personal work through indigenous television or indigenous community radio networks in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks, Dev. And indeed, you're right that local grassroots indigenous people have a lot of the solutions when it comes to adaptation to the effects of climate change. This is the whole field called traditional ecological knowledge, which, despite being acknowledged by the United Nations and so on, still is actually very difficult to integrate into policy. It seems like there's this big gap between perhaps Western style thinking and policy making and the difficulty in integrating traditional and indigenous knowledge. And hopefully we'll have a chance to speak a little bit more about this. But I wanted to ask you a bit about where you see hope in your communities, in your work. Victor and I briefly talked about social mobilization, social movements as a source of hope. Where are you seeing this hope for positive change in your work? And perhaps we can go to Leah once again.
Thank you. So you mentioned about like the disconnect of what we want to present or what we want to achieve and what's being imposed upon us. I think there's also a disconnect mainly on what development is seen, like how development is perceived like by the government or by businesses and how communities see it, which is very much related to climate change. An example is in our experience in the climate education curriculum development, where we have two fisherfolk women who we met after a long time. They were previously working against or struggling against an airport project of one of the biggest corporations in the Philippines, which is said to be an important part of development, but it will cause land reclamation, or they will clear the mangrove forests and then build the airport on top of it. It was also supported by international corporations and also, of course, by the government. And we were working with them to struggle against that project, but then we lost. The project got approved that it started, and they were all displaced from their community. So through this climate change curriculum, we met them again. And when we saw them for the first time, we were all crying because of the frustration that we experienced because of that project, which we know will cause greater damage to the community, greater flooding, storm surges when there are typhoons. And in the course of the project, where we had a trainer's training on climate education, they were inspired to continue working with other communities, even if they were already displaced. So they're saying that even if we were really sad and frustrated with what happened, we don't want that to happen to other communities, and we want to continue struggling. And even if they were harassed by the military, even if they faced great security risks because of their work, they continued to organize other communities near their area. So I think the inspiration for addressing climate change really comes from the communities. We can see here that when they are presented with opportunities, when they know that there are other people supporting them, they will have courage and continue to work. And then that would again cause a ripple effect with other communities, and then hopefully become a strong united movement. So I think even if we're facing misinformation of what development should look like, misinformation on how environmental defenders or climate activists are anti-development or anti-government, the local voices are still more powerful because they hold the truth. And I think that's where we see that it will become more powerful in uniting the communities and also environmental defenders at the national level. So I think, yeah, despite all the things that are happening, I think that's where the inspiration or where the hope comes from.
Thanks, Leah. And it's definitely a case of development for whom? You know, as you said, the government perceives development in one way, communities perceive it in a different way. People in cities perceive it in one way, people in rural areas perceive it in a different way. I don't know if Victor, perhaps you'd like to jump in, because I know that in Mexico, there's a lot of mass projects like the Maya train and other big projects that are about development and so on. And there's all this community mobilization, and maybe there's some hope there.
Sure. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to find hope. I remember all the time the quote from Antonio Gramsci, who said that the pessimism of intelligence should be compensated with the optimism of the will. Yes, we see how strong will of different social actors is. Social mobilization, even in such a complex society where we all are exposed to massive misinformation and disinformation, among other problems that societies in general face, but how different social expressions continue being vibrant, being active, contesting and challenging those decisions and projects coming from the elites. And as you say, particularly in our region, which is highly unequal and is it's been historically highly dominated by small oligarchic elite groups. We see now, I am very happy to say that even that the situation in my home country, Guatemala, is quite complex. We can see how the strong voices of those marginalized communities, particularly indigenous people, through their local authorities and representatives and collective organizations, remain very, very active, and not only resisting, but also proposing more fair and even more feasible solutions to local problems, development problems, including tackling the effects of climate change, which in our region are already present, intense and strong. I will lastly say that even in countries that are experiencing the most repressive regimes, such as Nicaragua, indigenous communities are bravely resisting, struggling, facing the toughest conditions. So seeing them and having the opportunity to support their organizations, for me, is a source of hope. I will stop here.
Thanks, Victor. And what's your take on all this, Dev, especially in Nepal, a country that's, of course, in between two big powers, India and China, that I'm sure are looking to Nepal's resources, and where indigenous people are defending those resources? What's the hope in your country?
Lorenzo, let's see the issue of climate change that we are discussing today is extremely important to people all across the globe, and including indigenous peoples. And there is no doubt that the changes in the climate on the Earth has already caused a devastating impact or effect on the people of all walks living in the planet. But the most vulnerable are the indigenous people, because the indigenous peoples, as I come from one of the indigenous community in Nepal, or indigenous peoples in Nepal, most of us, or most of our communities, actually live in geographically difficult and vulnerable places, like in the steep hills or at the river banks. having close relationship, obviously, with the nature or natural resources like land or the water or the forest. Therefore, naturally, the indigenous community, our communities are more vulnerable with the effect of the climate change. And as Leah already said that, Victor already shared that the climate change has already started to create a kind of effect on the livelihood or the other options for the livelihood of indigenous peoples. For example, there has been rainfalls which is getting erratic as a result that indigenous farmers are not able to plant their crops on the time, as well as there has been the frequency of actually drought has increased, resulting the threat of the food insecurity. And many indigenous peoples actually have been displaced from their own ancestral territory too. But as per the questions that you have asked me to share some of the hopes, the hope basically is that, what I see as I have been traveling to Asia or different UN forums is there has been global effort actually taking place to address the climate change or reducing a kind of impact that resulted by the climate change. And at least there has been a kind of talks about the indigenous peoples also to some extent. But one of the, the bad side that indigenous peoples have been presented as a victim, as I said earlier. They have been presented as local communities, but indigenous peoples are not shareholders or stakeholders or the local communities, but they are the right holders, and they are the right holders. So they don't want to be, defined as a local communities, but defined as indigenous peoples themselves. And the hope, actually, there has been discussions of, these compensations, actually, for the loss and damages that which have been impacted by the climate change. As we have been following the different COP processes, they are currently discussing about providing a kind of compensation for the loss or damages to the communities who have been impacted by the climate change. Though on the other side, the government are opposing that view. But we are hopeful that, and I think I also encourage to remain a kind of optimistic that there will be a strong kind of, voices which will be included in the decision making or in the negotiation level of providing compensations, and also there will be a meaningful participations of indigenous peoples in the policy formulations or providing a kind of compensation and that point. Since I have been following the UN processes or these COP processes, that indigenous peoples hardly have a kind of meaningful participations in the negotiation tables. So one of the concerns is to include them in the meaningful participation of indigenous peoples at the negotiating table. So at least somewhere the discussions or kind of concerns have come up, and I believe that international communities will look or will take indigenous people's voice seriously, and hopeful that will be addressed too. Thank you. I think I will stop here, and other issues I'll bring up.
Thank you, Dev. Yeah, indeed, the whole conversation around loss and damage at the international level has been the result of years and years of pushing and advocacy to even think about this, because for many years it was seen as like a red line. You cannot talk about loss and damage. For those of you who don't know, the loss and damage is this concept that countries in the north have to compensate financially countries that are affected by climate change, especially in situations where the damage is so significant that there's no way to fix it. And so there's all those conversations globally around how you would finance this loss and damage mechanism, which of course has challenges because even the climate finance mechanisms in place have not been fully financed. There's a commitment, I think, of $100 billion US dollars per year for climate finance. That has not been met. But I think we have time for one final question from myself, and then I'll open it to the floor. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about misinformation, disinformation. Leah, you said that indigenous people or local communities are seen as anti-development. Dev, you said that they're seen as victims and not as stakeholders or as subjects of rights. This is very much about the dominant discourse. And this is why we need grassroots media. This is why we need our own media to have our own discourse and counter those narratives. But I wanted to maybe hear a bit more in your context how misinformation, disinformation is playing out, and whether your communities or your organizations are doing anything about it. And if we can maybe keep it brief, maybe a minute or two, and then I'll open up to the rest of the attendees.
Okay, so for the disinformation, one of the stark examples is when we participated in the Universal Periodic Review of the UN Human Rights Council. So we went there with a submission on the situation of climate change and human rights and environmental defenders in the Philippines. So when we presented that a big part of the population is affected by climate change, a single typhoon can set back the livelihood of a family for years, and the climate activists are being attacked. So we were surprised that there is a prevailing rhetoric that our government is doing so much about climate change, and human rights violations are being addressed in the Philippines, and that includes attacks on environmental defenders. And our government is also saying that they're taking a lot of action, but what we see on the ground is very much different. So this includes false solutions like hydropower dams, which causes displacement of indigenous people. This includes nuclear power or natural gas. And they are encouraging investments from governments, from international corporations, which will eventually fall into infrastructure projects and not really address climate change. And they are also countering the narrative that there are a lot of people being killed. And I think since they're the ones having a lot of resources to spread this information, this is what the people are believing. And for a civil society who engage in this kind of space, which is very difficult to access, which is very expensive, I think we are at a disadvantage of presenting the truth or sharing the local voices at the international level. So I think this is one of the challenges that we're facing. We need more support to really bring out this information and put pressure to our government to do the climate action in the right way with consideration for human rights, and also counter misinformation. So I think that's one international space that we really see that there are conflicting information coming from the side of the government and the side of the local communities.
Thanks, Leah. Victor?
Well, following on that idea, I just would emphasize the huge gaps that we are seeing on the one hand between the ambition needed to really keep climate change at a manageable scale and the actual targets and objectives from the countries and international organisms. But the second, and for me, bigger or larger gap is between the formal objectives and the way policy instruments, but also the mainstream investments and projects are being implemented on the ground. And that's why I think it's very, very important to have societies in general and local voices particularly strengthened, active, and effective in terms of adding pressure to to the government at the national scale in first instance, but also other powerful actors present and driving the climate action main fronts. I also think that local voices are really, really important to bring feasible and lasting solutions, which are socially accepted, and not only accepted, but socially built from local knowledge, including traditional knowledge of many indigenous and customary communities around the world, combined with technology and science advance and developments all around the world as well. But building solutions from a respectful perspective in terms of social relationships, while adding pressure to the international community, particularly governments and large corporations. For me, it's very important role where local communities, including indigenous peoples and other traditional communities, are quite important. In summary, I would say that those communities continuing struggling with exclusion, repression, and violence. They are even under those conditions showing to the world how collective, fair, and socially and environmentally feasible and lasting actions are to become climate solutions.
Thank you, Victor. Perhaps, Deb, you can give us your brief input. In the meantime, I'll also ask everybody, if you have questions, now is the time to ask them, so please place them in the chat. Si tienen preguntas, por favor, pueden ingresar las preguntas en el chat. Si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez créer les questions dans le chat, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Deb, so perhaps briefly you can tell us about how this misinformation situation is affecting people in Nepal in a couple of minutes, so we can get a couple questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Before going into the misinformation or disinformations about the indigenous peoples, I would like to emphasize on the indigenous peoples' knowledge and their practices, which is really crucial for the protections of environment. And obviously, the indigenous peoples actually have played, a crucial role, not only, taking a lead in the environmental protections or defense, but their voices have hardly been heard in the, as we are talking about the climate change or biodiversity loss, but their voices have hardly been, addressed or heard. So, another thing, what we have to understand is the indigenous peoples, their, way of, living, or their practices or their rituals, which, including their traditions or the farming systems, or even the way of life, which are climate friendly, and all their rituals and the culture or way of living actually are contributing to mitigate the impact of the climate change. But the mainstream media, the coverage of the media, when we see, as I said at the beginning, that the indigenous peoples actually have been portrayed as the victim, one of the victims of the climate change, they have not been addressed as the knowledge holders in addressing the climate change. Therefore, what the indigenous, as media initiator, we have been advocating that there is a need to decolonize the media, and there is need to indigenize the media. The concept of decolonizing basically is, representing the indigenous journalists, more and more indigenous journalists in different media outlets, so that they actually can bring the indigenous people's perspective, or another perspective of the communities in a true way, because not many mainstream medias are covering indigenous people's issues, and even if they cover, they are portrayed negatively. Therefore, if there is meaningful participation of indigenous journalists in the mainstream media, then they can portray the real picture of indigenous community. Another one is we have also seen that there is also, to some extent, indigenous journalists have worked in mainstream media, but they are not making, they are not in the decision making of the media itself, so that their voices or their voices, or they have not been able to influence in the decision making or in the content generations. Therefore, there is a need to start of indigenous lead community media outlets. That is what we thought in 2016. We ourselves initiated community television in Nepal, and we have been producing TV programs into different indigenous languages, more than 20 indigenous languages that actually have brought a kind of, what we have been advocating is right to information, but we have been advocating that until and unless the information is available in mother tongue, the right to information is not adequate for the indigenous community. So even in the global level, as we are discussing about the climate change processes or any initiative, that kinds of discussion must be available in indigenous languages as well. But indigenous peoples may not be able to tell with the technical words as we have been discussing, but their voices should be heard adequately in the international level. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devin. We have a few questions. I'll actually direct each question to a specific panelist. The first one is from David in Colombia, who's asking about the relationship between health and climate change and whether that is, in any case, integrated in the work that you do. And I'm thinking maybe about the work that you did, Leah, in the Philippines. Did you integrate any health-related content in your curriculum? So that's a question for you. Let me phrase the questions for the other panelists. Perhaps for Dev would be, what is the level of cooperation between your organization or indigenous communities and governments in Nepal? Is there animosity, or are they working together? And for Victor, maybe I'll unite two questions, given that you're working at a foundation that has a larger view on things. Perhaps if you can talk about the risks around climate, an emphasis on climate finance as a solution posed to indigenous lands, peoples, and livelihoods. Perhaps this is related to the idea of carbon credits, as being seen as a solution. And perhaps if you could also say, are people seeing scenarios like the COP and the international UN spaces are too distant from the needs of the communities, or are they, do they understand them? Do they care? So those are the three questions that I have. So again, health for Leah, cooperation between government and local communities for Dev, and climate finance for Victor. So Leah, go ahead, please.
Thank you for the question. Yes, health has come up quite often in our discussions, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the Philippines has one of the longest lockdowns and it was very militaristic in approach, people are quite concerned what will happen if another pandemic broke out. So the sectors that raised this were mostly the indigenous people, since they're living in areas where there are still widespread, for example, malaria in many communities. I think this is of great concern. So they are really sharing how much the health situation has changed with the worsening climate change. And this is also something that we included in our curriculum. How should we try to observe what's the difference between the health situation in the varying years, and also what we should be doing to scale up our initiatives towards health and illness prevention. So yes, I think it's becoming more widely known that climate change is affecting the spread of diseases this is something that COVID-19 has also contributed to.
Thank you, Leah. Deb?
Thank you for the questions. As per the cooperation between the indigenous community and government, I see there is a gray area, in the sense that, as Leo presented earlier, that indigenous peoples have been depicted as anti-development, because the government is one who is staying at the center, at the capital city, decides what development infrastructure that need to be built in the area, in the remote area. For instance, the hydropower dam. Let me give you an example. In 2000, we have a history of 100 years of building of hydropower projects. Within 100 years, we have been able to produce 1,000 megawatts. But in 2016, government decided to build 10,000 megawatts of electricity within a decade. So government introduced this plan and welcomed the foreign direct investment in the hydropower sector. It welcomed World Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, Chinese banks are coming and making investment. All these hydropower dams, electricity projects, which are undertaken in the indigenous people's area, in the land, their territory, without fulfilling the free, prior, and informed consent. The indigenous peoples who are voicing against the government initiative, or let's say this development works, they have been presented, they have been detained, they have been threatened, they have been tortured, and many actually have been displaced. So actually, indigenous peoples have been, so this is one of the examples that how the cooperations, so you can sense the cooperation between the indigenous peoples and the government. And on the other hand, we have a lot of example of, government actually has introduced, let's say, converted indigenous, let's say, forest, which the indigenous peoples have long been protecting this forest without, without consent of indigenous peoples, into community forest, national parks, protected areas. And government has planned now to convert, let's say, the forest actually occupy about 24% of the earth of the Nepal's land, but now government has planned to increase up to 30% of the, this forest land. So all these forests, either you see there are, let's say, more than 12 national parks, 1 hunting reserve, 1 wildlife reserves, 13 buffer zones, about 33 different protected areas. All these forests actually were part of the indigenous forest. Indigenous communities were protecting. They have been converted into these protected areas without consulting with the indigenous peoples. There is conflict in each and every national parks, in each and every protected areas between indigenous community and government. So from this level of, from this incidents, you can sense that what sort of cooperation we have with the, with the government. So so that we are trying to bring these voices to the different levels. I think that gives you the answers. Thank you.
Well, that's a difficult context for sure. Victor.
Well, thanks for the questions, which are not easy to answer, but I will try to do my best. I think one part of my answer is related to both questions: the risk on climate finance systems, and also the possible connections between all these, I call them stratospheric conversations, negotiations, for example, of the UN Convention on Climate Change, the COP, its COP, and the local realities and local policy frameworks and political context in the countries. Emphasizing the need for every organization working on territories, natural resources, social justice, rights, to first of all prioritize being better informed regarding the government's commitments to the convention in terms of climate action, particularly the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which is the formal commitment of the countries to the convention in terms of the main fronts of climate action. It is important because I would say that an important part of the NDCs present formal objectives that are quite disconnected with domestic objectives of public policy. That is a very common thing, and that reflects that systemic disconnection, the gaps that I mentioned before between the formal statements at the international level and formal ambition and objectives and targets and what is going on the ground. So it's very important to start adding pressure as societies and civil society organizations to the governments and also to the international financial institutions such as the World Bank and others that mentioned to hold them accountable. On the one hand, to respect the commitments and to be coherent, because we have international financial institutions that with one hand, they support climate action related projects, and with the other hand, they support the drastic increase on fossil fuel extraction investments, for example, or the renewable energy investments and projects that are socially and environmentally harmful for peoples and for ecosystems. So that is, for in my answer, the common ground between the two questions. I would say that the risk of climate finance are real as long as they are part of the hegemonic financial and economic system in the world. We have seen, for example, how many carbon credit projects I have worked with around or related to some of the forest carbon credit projects that lead to unfair arrangements between indigenous peoples, local communities that have formal rights recognized on their lands and forests, and the whole cloud of consultants, standards, agents, and intermediaries of the climate finance world. So indeed, there are many risks. I would suggest, first of all, to have access to more information regarding integrity of the carbon markets, which is an important global debate right now, and trying to support climate solutions based on local commitments where the international finance mechanisms could add a clear value, but also with clear roles and standards, particularly to respect human rights and indigenous people's rights. Personally, I don't trust in the internationally driven mechanisms without clear connections or respect for local environmental and social agendas led by the local communities and the governments at the different levels. For example, we at the Climate and Land Use Alliance, that is an alliance of philanthropic foundations that Ford is member of, we support here in Mexico the discussion of the subnational government, the state governments, to put in place a carbon finance mechanisms, but only when they are in complement to clear environmental and social agendas of those governments. We do not directly support governments, but we support civil society organizations and grassroots organizations that engage with those governments to solve specific environmental and climate issues. So I would suggest that. And finally, to say that the one, Carolina, that asked for Colombia, that at this moment, for example, when in Latin America, both Colombia and Brazil governments and presidents, Petro and Lula, are trying to lead an international effort toward the COP30 in Brazil, it's important to get more involvement with their ideas and to keep them accountable, to be coherent in terms of balancing respect of rights with feasible and lasting climate action. I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Victor. It seems like there's a lot to say, really, and not enough time. The work that is being done in between Brazil and Colombia and other countries in the Amazon region is quite remarkable, as is the work being done in Africa by the African Union to have a global South voice as well. And in fact, WACC is evolved these days and some work in the Amazon, and hopefully that will be successful. But I would like to wrap it up now because it is now 6 minutes past the time. So, and I realize that well, some of you have to go to sleep, some of you have to go have breakfast, and so on. So once again, I'd like to thank you. I wanted to do recommendations for the COP, but I don't think we have the time. If anything, I would say that a lot of it has to do with respecting commitments around human rights, around free, prior, and informed consent, as well as this idea of coherence, that you cannot do what Victor was saying. You cannot be promoting climate adaptation and mitigation with one hand, and then with the other hand, you cannot be financing coal extraction and oil extraction and so on. But as my colleague Sarah is saying, you can continue the conversation on our WACC channels at WACC Global. And once again, thank you so much, and we wish you the best for the rest of your day or evening.